In the year 1477, Brittany was a land of mystery and beauty, framed by dense forests and the wild, ever-changing coastline. It was a place of legends, where the sea seemed to stretch to the edges of the world, and the land whispered of ancient kings and forgotten wars. Yet, despite its independence and proud history, Brittany stood on the brink of a great change, caught in the crossfire between two powerful nations, France and England. The small city of Nantes, where the Loire River met the sea, was the heart of Brittany's power. It was here, on the cold winter's day of January 25th, that Anne of Brittany was born. Her birth was not just a moment of joy for her family, but a turning point in the history of Brittany itself. Anne was the daughter of Francis II, the Duke of Brittany, and Margaret of Foix, a woman of noble birth who had come from the south. She was the third child and second daughter of Francis and Margaret. The Duchy of Brittany had been ruled by Francis since 1465, a time when tensions with France were high. Despite his best efforts, Duke Francis could not keep the threat of annexation at bay. His struggle to preserve Brittany's independence had led him into endless diplomatic negotiations, military alliances, and skirmishes with his larger neighbor, France. From the very moment of Anne's birth, the young Duchess's life was tethered to the fate of her homeland. The people of Brittany had no illusions about the precarious position their duchy was in. They knew that the land of the Bretons, though fiercely proud and independent, would one day face a reckoning, a day when its fate would no longer be in its own hands. The circumstances of Anne's early life were marked by a series of political crises that would shape her future. While her father had ruled Brittany for over a decade, his reign was not without its challenges. The King of France, Louis XI, had long harbored designs on Brittany, seeking to unite the duchy with his own kingdom. The threat of French domination hung over the heads of every Breton, and for Anne, it was a constant reality she would never escape. Brittany had always been a thorn in the side of the French monarchy. The region's independence was a source of constant tension. Over the centuries, the Bretons had resisted attempts to be absorbed into France, preserving their distinct language, customs, and way of life. Yet, despite their best efforts, the Bretons knew that France would eventually seek to annex them, and Anne's birth marked the beginning of a new chapter in this age-old struggle. Though Anne's birth was a moment of joy for her parents, it was also one marked by the looming uncertainty of the political landscape. Her father, Duke Francis II, had only one heir, Anne. This made her the most valuable asset in the struggle for Brittany's independence. However, there was a deeper issue at play. Duke Francis, although he ruled with strength and ambition, was not a young man. He had already fathered several children, but his heirs had died young, and his health was rapidly declining. Anne's life would be shaped by the uncertainty of her father's legacy and the looming question of who would inherit the throne of Brittany. From her earliest days, Anne would know that she was not simply a princess, she was a future duchess, and the weight of that responsibility would be with her for the rest of her life. Anne's early years were marked by the watchful eyes of her father and the heavy expectations placed on her shoulders. While many children of noble birth enjoyed the luxuries of royal life, Anne's upbringing was tempered with a sense of duty and preparation for a future she had no control over. Despite her youth, Anne was keenly aware of her position within the broader world of politics. Her father, ever the astute diplomat, was determined to ensure that Anne would grow up understanding the intricacies of power, alliances, and negotiation. At the age of 5, she began formal lessons, studying Latin, French, and the history of her people. Yet, despite her education, her childhood was far from carefree. Anne was often isolated from her peers, kept within the confines of her father's court, surrounded by advisors, tutors, and diplomats. But what perhaps defined Anne's early years more than anything else was the absence of a mother. Her mother, Margaret of Foix, died when Anne was just 9 years old, leaving a gap in her life that no amount of tutors could fill. Anne's relationship with her father became increasingly important as she grew older, especially as the political situation in Brittany became more volatile. Her father's health began to fail, and the constant threat of French intervention only intensified the pressure on the young heir. Despite the loss of her mother, Anne's upbringing was still one of privilege, steeped in the traditions of courtly life. She was taught to dance, to sing, and to recite poetry, all the elements that made her a fitting future queen. Yet, even in her youth, there was an unspoken recognition that Anne's beauty, intelligence, and poise would be used as political leverage. She was not just a princess. She was a commodity, to be married off for the sake of her people's survival. In the years to come, Anne's destiny would be shaped by the complex and shifting alliances between the powerful kingdoms of France, England, and Brittany. As the duchy's future hinged on her marriage, Anne would come to understand the precarious nature of power and the fine line between duty and personal happiness. By the time Anne was 10 years old, the political landscape of Brittany was rapidly changing. Duke Francis II, her father, had struggled for years to preserve the autonomy of his duchy. The King of France, Louis XV, was no fool. He knew that Brittany, with its rich land and strategic location, was a prize that would solidify France's dominance in Western Europe. Louis had long coveted Brittany, and his ambitions to annex it were no secret. Anne's birth and subsequent position as the heir to the ducal throne made her a target of French manipulation. By 1486, when Anne was just 9 years old, the political situation was dire. Louis XV had begun negotiations to marry his own son, Charles VIII, to Anne, making her a pawn in the French king's designs. The Bretons, however, were not so easily swayed. Anne's father, Duke Francis, remained steadfast in his determination to keep Brittany free from French influence. He refused to allow his daughter to be married off to a French prince without his consent. As Anne entered her early adolescence, the world around her began to change. She was no longer a mere child sheltered from the harsh realities of political power, the weight of her future as the Duchess of Brittany, and potentially a future Queen of France, pressed heavily on her young shoulders. At the tender age of 10, she was already aware of the significance of her station and the role she would have to play in the tangled web of European politics. Her father, Duke Francis, too, was still alive, but his health was in decline. The once formidable ruler, who had fought so fiercely for Brittany's independence, was now weakened by illness, unable to withstand the pressure from the French king, Louis XV. The French king, who had been waiting for an opportunity to annex Brittany into the Kingdom of France, saw Anne's marriage as the key to this long-held ambition. Anne's life was carefully controlled by her father's advisors, who sought to ensure her education was both political and royal. She studied the art of diplomacy, learning how to negotiate with powerful suitors, and was trained in the complex languages of power. Anne's intelligence and quick learning were assets that would serve her well. Her beauty, however, would become both a blessing and a curse. Her refined features, dark, expressive eyes, fair skin, and raven hair, would make her an object of desire for kings and princes alike. But they would also place her at the center of political games far beyond her control. Though Anne was taught the finer arts of court life, music, dancing, and poetry, there was a growing sense of duty that overtook her youthful desires. Every conversation she had seemed to center on alliances, marriage prospects, and the future of Brittany. Her childhood was quickly fading, replaced by a life of courtly duties and rigid expectations. At age 11, Anne found herself constantly under the scrutiny of those around her. Noblemen from both Brittany and France frequently visited the court to discuss her potential marriage. Her father, although physically frail, remained determined to retain control over the succession of Brittany, and he knew that securing his daughter's marriage to a powerful man was the only way to guarantee his duchy's survival. In 1486, when Anne was just 11 years old, her father received a proposal that would alter the course of her life. King Louis XVIII of France, ever the cunning diplomat, sought to secure Anne's marriage to his own son, Charles VIII. If Anne were to marry the French prince, Brittany would become a vassal of France, and the long-standing Breton independence would come to an end. Duke Francis II, though weakened by age and illness, was not willing to relinquish his daughter's future so easily. The idea of Brittany becoming a province of France was unthinkable to him, and he knew that Anne's marriage would be the key to preserving the duchy's sovereignty. He steadfastly rejected the French king's proposal, much to the chagrin of the French court. But Louis XV was a man of strategy, and he had no intention of letting the opportunity slip away. He began to employ more subtle tactics to gain control of the young Duchess. Diplomats were dispatched to offer various incentives and promises to Duke Francis in an attempt to persuade him to accept the marriage proposal. Meanwhile, Anne was kept isolated at court, surrounded by advisors and counselors who were loyal to her father, but who also understood the power dynamics at play. Despite the pressure from both her father's court and the French court, Anne remained steadfast. She understood the stakes of her marriage, but she also knew the consequences of becoming a pawn in a game of power. Her heart, still young and untouched by the complications of court politics, yearned for something more than what was being dictated to her. Her father's health continued to decline, and in 1487, when Anne was 12, the duchy found itself facing yet another external threat. The King of France, Louis XV, grew impatient with Duke Francis's defiance and began preparing for military action. The Breton nobles, loyal to their duchy but also fearful of French power, began to fracture. Some of them saw the wisdom in aligning with France, believing that this would protect them from the inevitable invasion. Others, however, held firm to the belief that Brittany must remain independent at all costs. Anne found herself caught in the middle of a political storm she had not yet fully understood. While her father's illness became more pronounced, his determination never wavered. He began to seek other alliances in Europe, hoping to gain military support from England and other neighboring kingdoms. As the years passed, Anne's education became more intense, and the responsibilities of her future were ever present. At the age of 13, she was formally betrothed to Maximilian of Austria, an alliance brokered by her father in the hope of securing a powerful European partner who would help Brittany resist the looming French threat. The marriage to Maximilian was not only a diplomatic move but also a response to the increasing pressure from Louis XV. As Anne's betrothal to Maximilian became public, the political landscape of Brittany grew even more complicated. The French king was enraged by the alliance, seeing it as a direct challenge to his designs on the duchy. Louis XV, desperate to neutralize this threat, continued to press for Anne's marriage to Charles VIII, and he began to intensify his military campaigns against Brittany. Despite the looming threat of war, Anne, now 14, had begun to find her voice. Her upbringing, shaped by her father's resolve and her mother's early death, had turned her into a young woman of great intelligence and strength. She understood the weight of her position and began to prepare herself for the inevitable conflicts that lay ahead. In 1488, Anne's life took a dramatic turn. As the French forces moved closer to the Breton capital, Nantes, Duke Francis was forced to agree to a humiliating peace treaty with Louis XV. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Versailles, saw Anne's marriage to Charles VIII of France as a condition for peace. Although Anne was still technically betrothed to Maximilian, her future was now firmly tied to the French throne. The signing of the treaty was a devastating blow to Anne. Though she had no love for Charles VIII, she knew that this marriage was now the only way to ensure the survival of Brittany, no matter the cost to her personal happiness. As the negotiations concluded, Anne's heart was heavy with the realization that her life would be forever shaped by the demands of politics, diplomacy, and the desires of the powerful men who sought to control her. The Treaty of Versailles had far-reaching consequences, not only for Anne but for Brittany itself. Her marriage to Charles VIII was sealed, and with it, the fate of Brittany was decided. The duchy, once a proud and independent land, was now forever linked to the Kingdom of France. Anne, still a teenager, had become the symbol of her people's hopes and their greatest sacrifice. Though the people of Brittany would never forget their duchy's loss, they hoped that through Anne's marriage their legacy would endure. But the reality of Anne's situation was far from easy. Her marriage to Charles VIII was politically motivated, and their relationship at best could be described as cold. Anne's life was now one of diplomacy, negotiation, and survival. But even as the Queen of France, she never forgot her roots. and she continued to advocate for her people, even when faced with the oppressive weight of the French crown. Anne's marriage to Charles VIII, sealed by the Treaty of Versailles, was not one forged out of love or mutual affection. For her, it was a diplomatic necessity, a sacrifice to protect the remnants of Brittany's independence. For him, it was a political move, a way to consolidate control over the rebellious duchy that had long defied French rule. At the age of 14, Anne stepped into the royal court of France, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her duty to her people and her crown would always come before her personal desires. When Anne arrived in Paris to marry Charles, the grandeur of the French court was both overwhelming and alien. The Palace of the Louvre, a symbol of French power and opulence, was now her new home. The tapestries and gilded chandeliers, the endless halls and marble floors, were all a stark contrast to the life she had known in Brittany. Gone were the days of her childhood, when she had roamed freely through the forests of Rennes, her home. Here, in the gilded cages of the French court, Anne was a prisoner, one whose every move was scrutinized and whose every word was weighed. For political value, the marriage itself was a brief and perfunctory ceremony, with little ceremony or warmth. Charles, though no older than Anne, was already a king, weighed down by the expectations of his throne. He was reserved and distant, his youthful charm buried beneath the weight of kingship. While Anne had long understood the political stakes of this union, the lack of genuine affection from her new husband was a harsh reality that she struggled to reconcile with the woman she wanted to be. For the first time in her life, Anne was utterly alone. She had grown up surrounded by her father's court and her loyal counselors, but here in Paris, she was in the midst of strangers, men and women whose loyalties were not to Brittany, but to the French crown. Her sense of identity was fractured. The Duchess of Brittany, now Queen of France, was torn between the conflicting duties of being a wife, a ruler, and a symbol of her nation's legacy. Her new life was far from the fairy tale she had once imagined as a young girl. Gone were the hopes of a marriage based on companionship and shared dreams. Instead, her life now consisted of endless state functions, political maneuvering, and the realization that her every action, every decision, would be scrutinized by the French court and by the people of Brittany, who had once looked to her as their last hope. Charles VIII, though king, was still young and inexperienced in the art of ruling a kingdom. His passions lay elsewhere, mainly in his desire to expand France's borders and strengthen its military presence in Italy. His mind was consumed by the Italian wars, and his interest in Anne was more a matter of political necessity than a reflection of affection. He saw her as the key to consolidating his hold over Brittany, but beyond that, there was little connection between the two. Anne, however, was not so easily ignored. Despite the chilly reception from her husband, she soon realized that she was not powerless in this marriage. While Charles was busy with his military ambitions, Anne quickly became aware of the political weight she carried. She was a queen, not just a figurehead, but the living embodiment of Brittany's hopes for survival. As time went on, she began to assert herself more in the court, her intelligence and diplomatic acumen earning her the respect of many courtiers. Her first real test came shortly after her arrival in Paris, when rumors of rebellion in Brittany reached the French court. The Breton nobles, disillusioned by the French takeover, were beginning to stir, and the idea of an independent Brittany was still alive in the hearts of many. Anne knew that her position in France was precarious, and she could feel the growing tension between her loyalty to her people and her duty to her husband. She began to use her position as queen to influence the direction of French policy, advocating for the preservation of some form of autonomy for Brittany. But every time she attempted to make her voice heard, she faced opposition from the French nobility, who saw her efforts as a threat to their control. Charles, too, was distant and indifferent to her concerns, more focused on the campaigns in Italy than the fate of Brittany. For Anne, it was a painful realization. Her marriage to Charles VIII might have secured Brittany's survival in the short term, but it had also placed her in a position where she could not fully protect her homeland. At the age of 15, Anne's life took another turn. She had been married to Charles for nearly a year, but her role as queen was not what she had hoped. Charles, though he occasionally showed her affection in public, was emotionally distant. He had little time for her, instead preferring the company of his ministers and military advisors. Anne's growing sense of isolation was compounded by her fear that the French king might soon forget his promises to preserve Brittany's rights. Despite her isolation, Anne never lost sight of her responsibilities as queen. She knew that the power of her position did not lie solely in the grandeur of the court, but in her ability to navigate the intricate web of politics that enveloped her. It was at this point that she began to take a more active role in French affairs. She understood that the French court was full of intrigue, and her ability to forge alliances, even within the royal family, was key to her survival. Anne's political savvy was soon recognized, especially by her advisors. She became known for her sharp mind, her ability to see through the false facades of the court, and her understanding of the delicate balance of power in France. She started using her influence to protect Brittany's interests, pushing for policies that would benefit her homeland, even if they went against the will of her husband's ministers. One of her first successes came when she managed to secure a promise from Charles to protect the rights of the Breton nobility, a crucial point in maintaining Brittany's semi-autonomous status within the French kingdom. It was a small victory, but one that bolstered Anne's confidence and earned her the respect of many in the French court who had previously dismissed her as just another pawn in the political game. Her relationship with Charles, though still distant, began to shift in some ways. Over time, Charles came to recognize Anne's political intelligence and her loyalty to Brittany, and he began to rely on her counsel. While their marriage may never have been a love match, they found a certain mutual respect. Anne was not just the queen by virtue of her marriage. She was a queen in her own right, wielding power through diplomacy and cunning. However, Anne's personal life remained a complicated and lonely affair. The pressure to conceive an heir to the throne weighed heavily on her. In the early years of her marriage, she suffered a series of miscarriages that deepened her sense of isolation. The French court, already skeptical of her, began to whisper about her inability to bear children. Anne, though strong in public, was deeply affected by these rumors, and her longing for the love and affection she had been denied only grew. But even in these personal trials, Anne's resolve remained unbroken. Her sense of duty to both France and Brittany drove her to persevere. She knew that her role as queen was not just about bearing an heir, but also about securing her people's future. It was this understanding of her duty, combined with her intelligence and strength, that would ultimately shape her legacy as one of the most formidable women in European history. In the midst of her personal challenges, Anne's political acumen would soon lead to her first major triumph. In 1491, after years of negotiation and struggle, she was able to secure a marriage contract with Maximilian of Austria, her long-ago betrothed, to ensure that Brittany would not be completely absorbed into France. Although this marriage never came to fruition due to political maneuvering, it was a testament to Anne's determination and her ability to protect her homeland's interests. Her success was hard-won and came at great personal cost. But Anne had learned to balance the weight of the crown with the needs of her people. She was no longer the young girl who had arrived in Paris, unsure of her role. She was now a queen who understood the full burden of her position, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that Brittany would not be lost to the tides of history. By the year 1492, Anne had spent nearly 3 years as queen consort of France. Though her marriage to Charles VIII had begun without affection, Anne had slowly gained influence in the French court. Her keen understanding of politics had allowed her to navigate the delicate web of courtly intrigues and factions. Though she knew her position was always precarious, her power, while real, was often an illusion in the eyes of others. The French nobility, though outwardly respectful of her, never fully accepted her as a true member of the royal family. Her position as queen was seen by many as a temporary concession, the product of a treaty and not the result of a love match or dynastic alliance. This perception, Anne knew, could work against her. But the queen was no longer just a pawn in the game of politics. She was a player in her own right. The French court, under the reign of Charles VIII, was filled with ambition and uncertainty. Charles himself was an enigmatic figure, ambitious yet indecisive, passionate about his military campaigns, but often distracted by personal whims. His long-term goal was to assert French dominance in Italy, a goal that would lead to years of conflict known as the Italian Wars. Yet Charles's neglect of domestic matters, particularly the concerns of Brittany, left Anne in a precarious position. Anne had long been wary of the growing influence of the French nobles who surrounded her husband. Men like Louis of Orleans, who had aspirations of his own, were constantly plotting to manipulate Charles. Anne, in her quiet moments, was aware of the intrigues that surrounded her. The throne of France, despite its grandeur, was one of unstable foundations. It was around this time that the whispers of rebellion began to rise again in Brittany. The Bretons, ever proud and defiant, had not forgotten their history of independence. The Treaty of Verger, which had secured Anne's marriage to Charles, had promised to preserve Brittany's autonomy, an agreement that was continually under threat from the aggressive expansionist policies of the French king. Anne felt the weight of her duty, the responsibility to protect her people, pressing down on her every day. Her personal struggles were compounded by the political ones. With each passing month, Anne's sense of isolation grew. She had not yet borne an heir to the throne of France, and the court murmured about her failure to produce a child. These whispers, though often quiet, had a sharp edge. The queen's inability to fulfill her most sacred duty, producing an heir, was seen as a flaw, a weakness in her political armor. And Anne, despite her many successes in diplomacy, could not escape the shadow of this growing perception. In the summer of 1493, the tides of war began to pull Charles away from Brittany entirely. The French king, consumed by his ambitions in Italy, launched a series of military campaigns, leaving Anne to rule France in his absence. The queen had grown accustomed to his long absences, and over time she had learned to govern in his stead, though always mindful of the delicate balance she had to maintain with the French nobility. While Charles fought for his claim to the Italian throne, Anne fought her own battle, the battle to maintain her autonomy and her people's rights. The rebellious Breton lords, led by men who had resisted French control, were emboldened by the king's absence. They saw the French monarch's preoccupation with foreign wars as an opportunity to challenge the French presence in Brittany once more. Anne knew that a full rebellion in Brittany would be disastrous, not just for the kingdom, but for her marriage. The French court would not tolerate any challenges to their rule over the duchy, and Anne feared that any significant resistance would lead to retaliation, perhaps even bloodshed. But she also knew that if she was to maintain the fragile peace that had been brokered between her people and the French crown, she would need to take action. At the same time, Anne had to navigate her complex relationship with Charles. The king's indifference toward her had only deepened since the marriage. He was more focused on his military endeavors than on his queen or her needs. The emotional distance between them seemed insurmountable, but Anne knew that as long as she was the queen, she had a duty to protect the realm, and her marriage was a political contract, not a romantic one. In a way, Anne had accepted her loneliness, understanding that the political survival of Brittany was her true priority. Anne's first major challenge as regent came in late 1493, when a Breton nobleman, Jean de Rohan, led an uprising against French troops stationed in Brittany. Jean, a skilled military leader, had long harbored ambitions of restoring Brittany's full independence. His rebellion was a direct threat to French rule, and Anne, who had been acting as regent in Charles's absence, was faced with a difficult decision. To avoid a civil war that could destroy Brittany's fragile autonomy, Anne made the difficult choice to negotiate with Jean de Rohan. She sent emissaries to meet with him, promising to bring his grievances to the French king in exchange for his withdrawal of support for the rebellion. But this was not an easy task. The French court was already questioning Anne's loyalty to the crown, and any negotiations with the rebellious Breton lords would be seen as a betrayal. In the halls of the French court, Anne was accused of treasonous behavior. But despite the backlash, she refused to back down. She understood that she was not just a pawn in the game of French politics. She was a queen, and her loyalty was first and foremost to the people of Brittany. If Charles and his court were unwilling to protect Brittany's autonomy, she would take matters into her own hands. As 1494 drew to a close, the rebellion in Brittany simmered. but it was far from over. The nobles and lords who had once supported the French crown now began to question the wisdom of their allegiance. Meanwhile, Anne continued to exercise her political cunning, using her position as queen to safeguard Brittany's future. However, her struggles at court were not limited to her political battles. Anne's personal life remained fraught with difficulties. Though Charles had promised her that their marriage would be fruitful in securing an heir to the French throne, the queen had been unable to conceive. The pressure of bearing an heir weighed heavily on Anne, and every passing month felt like an eternity. She had suffered through several miscarriages, each one more devastating than the last. In the quiet moments when she was alone in her chamber, Anne would often weep for the child she had lost. But she could not show this vulnerability to the French court. As queen, she had to appear strong, unyielding, a symbol of France's power. And so, she wore her sorrow like a mask, hiding her pain behind a veneer of calm and dignity. Yet despite the personal turmoil, Anne remained determined to protect her people. She continued to fight for Brittany's rights, even as she navigated the treacherous waters of the French court, the rebellion in Brittany, the murmurs of discontent within the French nobility, and the growing tension between herself and Charles were all signs that the shifting tides of power were beginning to pull her in different directions. By the end of 1494, Anne's position had become more precarious than ever. She had managed to avert a full-scale war in Brittany, but the conflict was far from over. The struggle for Brittany's autonomy and Anne's role in securing that future would define the years to come. But one thing was clear. Anne was no longer the innocent young girl who had arrived at the French court 3 years before. She had grown into a queen who understood the full weight of her crown, the intricacies of power, and the sacrifices she would need to make in order to protect her homeland. The year 1495 ushered in a new chapter for Anne. The political landscape of France was shifting dramatically, and the queen could no longer ignore the weight of the changes sweeping across Europe. As Charles VIII's Italian campaign stretched on, it became evident that his dreams of conquest were not just fantasies. They were realities that would draw the entire continent into conflict. The French king's obsession with Italy and the riches of the peninsula had become the defining issue of his reign, overshadowing every other matter, including the state of Brittany. Anne found herself increasingly alienated, not just from Charles but also from the court that had once seemed to be her domain. She was no longer the young queen, surrounded by advisors eager to gain her favor. Now she was a woman forced to navigate a labyrinth of power, mistrust, and isolation. Charles's long absences had created a power vacuum at court, one that Anne was struggling to fill, especially as rumors of her infertility persisted. Yet despite her personal struggles, Anne remained steadfast. She understood that the heart of her power lay not just in her marriage to Charles, but in her ability to protect Brittany, and in this she had no illusions. The French court had no love for Brittany, and the people of her duchy were constantly reminded that they were subjects of the French king, not independent rulers of their own land. Anne's challenge was to balance her role as a queen of France with her duties as the guardian of Brittany's autonomy. The winds of change were not just political. They were personal too. Anne had already experienced the pain of multiple miscarriages, each loss a reminder of the fragility of life. The pressure to provide Charles with an heir had been unrelenting. Her failures, real or perceived, made her an object of gossip at court. While some whispered that her infertility was a punishment for her marriage to Charles, others hinted at more sinister reasons for her childlessness. Anne, however, never allowed these rumors to affect her determination. But as she navigated the complex tides of politics and power, Anne began to see that her role was changing. The queen could no longer rely solely on her beauty or charm to maintain influence. Her mind, sharp and calculating, had become her greatest asset. In the quieter moments, when Charles was away, she studied the movements of the French nobility, learned the ambitions of her rivals, and carefully considered the future of Brittany. In early 1495, a new threat to Brittany emerged, one that would force Anne to act decisively. The French court had long seen the duchy as a prize to be claimed, a jewel that would solidify France's dominance over Western Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, which had secured Anne's marriage to Charles, had been the last major concession granted to Brittany, but Charles's interests in Italy had made him less focused on his promises to her and to the Bretons. In response to the growing dissatisfaction among his court and the nobles of Brittany, Anne decided to take a step that would shock the French court. She sent emissaries to the Duke of Savoy, one of the most influential powers in the Italian peninsula, to discuss an alliance. This would be a bold move, one that would not only undermine the French king's interests, but also potentially provoke war. But Anne had no other choice. Her heart ached for Brittany, for the land that had shaped her, and for her people, who remained on the edge of French control. Her actions, however, would not go unnoticed. The French court was quick to respond. Anne's decision to approach an outside power, especially one so closely tied to the Italian affairs that consumed her husband, was seen as a betrayal. Whispers began to circulate that the Queen was no longer loyal to France, that she was conspiring against the very crown that had granted her so much. The accusations were dangerous, and Anne knew that she would need to act quickly to avoid being trapped in a web of deceit and treachery. Her delicate political maneuvering would lead to a confrontation with Charles when he returned to the French court after months of military engagement. The moment of reckoning was imminent, and Anne knew that her marriage to Charles could not survive if it became clear that her loyalty to France was in question. Anne had always been a woman of action, and in the wake of her bold diplomatic moves, she found herself at the center of a storm. The French court was seething with suspicion, and many saw Anne's secretive meetings with foreign powers as a direct challenge to French sovereignty. Though her actions had been motivated by the need to protect Brittany, they were viewed as disloyalty in the eyes of the French nobility. What Anne hadn't anticipated was the speed with which the situation would escalate. As tensions mounted, Charles VIII returned to France, a man embittered by the failure of his Italian ambitions. The French king had hoped that his military exploits in Italy would cement his place in history, but the campaign had not gone as planned. Charles had suffered defeats, and his dreams of a French empire had been shattered. For all his claims to greatness, Charles returned to his kingdom with a sense of humiliation and frustration. The Queen, Anne, had been the one bright spot in his life. But now, the rumors swirling about her disloyalty threatened to tear their relationship apart. The tension between Anne and Charles reached a boiling point in the spring of 1495. During a private meeting between the two in the royal palace of Amboise, Charles confronted Anne about her actions. His voice was cold and accusing as he demanded an explanation for her secret negotiations with the Duke of Savoy. The Queen, who had never before faced such an outburst from her husband, remained calm. She explained that her actions were driven by the needs of Brittany, by the responsibility she felt to her people, and that her loyalty to France remained unwavering. But Charles was not convinced. He accused Anne of placing Brittany above the crown, of prioritizing her homeland over their marriage. His accusations were not without merit. Anne's dedication to her people had, at times, overshadowed her commitment to the French throne. The confrontation ended without resolution, and the tension between the two grew palpable. As Charles returned to his military campaigns, Anne was left alone once more to confront the political quagmire that threatened to swallow her. The question that haunted her now was whether she could truly continue to play the role of both queen and protector of Brittany. Could she maintain her power in a court that increasingly viewed her as a threat to the crown? Could she continue to balance the competing demands of her people, her husband, and her own desires for autonomy? Part 4. The Quiet Before the Storm. The summer of 1495 passed quietly, but the storm that had been building in the heart of France was far from over. Anne spent her days in the royal palaces, receiving ambassadors, reviewing state matters, and keeping her finger on the pulse of the court. But the pressure on her was unrelenting. She could no longer trust anyone, not even the closest of her advisors. Every move she made was watched, every word she spoke scrutinized. It seemed as though the walls were closing in on her from all sides. But Anne was a survivor. She had always been resourceful, and she knew that her greatest strength lay not in her beauty or her marriage, but in her ability to adapt and overcome. She had already weathered many storms, and though the winds of change were stronger than ever, Anne remained resolute. Her commitment to Brittany was unwavering, and she would do whatever it took to secure the future of her people. As the year drew to a close, Anne realized that the winds of change were not just a passing storm. They were the harbingers of something far greater, something that would reshape her destiny and the fate of Brittany forever. The new year of 1496 dawned cold and uncertain for Anne. The long months of political intrigue and isolation had hardened her resolve, but they had also deepened her sense of loneliness. Her relationship with Charles had become strained, frayed, by his growing resentment and the ongoing tensions within the French court. Though they still shared a formal bond, the personal connection that once united them seemed to be slipping away. Charles VIII, once a youthful and ambitious king, had returned from his failed Italian campaign a different man. The energy and optimism that had defined his early reign had been replaced with a quiet bitterness. His desire for conquest had not only failed but had also left France vulnerable. The crown's authority over Brittany was shaky, and the king's priorities lay increasingly with military expeditions rather than domestic affairs. Anne's role as queen, once central to her identity, now felt distant. She had long since ceased to be a mere political pawn in her marriage, but the lack of a child to secure her position had placed her in an awkward position. Rumors about her infertility had reached every corner of the court, and while some of those rumors were whispered in cruel jest, others suggested that the French nobility was beginning to lose patience with her inability to produce an heir. Anne's desire for a child was a private anguish that no one could truly understand. Each miscarriage, each loss, felt like a personal failure, but she could not afford to be seen as vulnerable. If the court thought her weak, they would strike, and Brittany would be lost. Even worse, her marriage to Charles, once seen as a triumph of diplomacy, was now a potential threat to her survival as queen. The French court's loyalty to their king could never be guaranteed. The nobility was a fickle creature, and the queen's failure to provide an heir had only fueled their discontent. Her advisors urged her to seek reconciliation with Charles, to put aside the growing political rifts and focus on repairing their relationship. But Anne knew better than to trust in fleeting gestures. The damage was already done. Charles had become so absorbed in his own ambitions that he could no longer understand the sacrifices she made for Brittany. And so, their marriage became a silent battleground, each side retreating into their own corner. Anne, in contrast, found solace in her people. She continued to rule Brittany with the same careful calculation, ensuring that no one could challenge her authority. Her political acumen became her weapon, and the duchy's independence her shield. But the rift between her and Charles could not be ignored for much longer. It was in the summer of 1496, during one of Charles's visits to Brittany, that the true extent of the fracture between the couple became undeniable. The occasion was a grand banquet, held in the city of Nantes. Anne had worked tirelessly to make the event a success, hoping to mend the widening chasm between herself and her husband. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that her efforts were futile. Charles arrived late, his face darkened by the shadows of his recent military setbacks. He spoke little and drank too much, his every gesture more and more dismissive of his queen. The court, aware of the tension, began to murmur behind their fans and silks. Anne, always composed, did her best to present a calm face, but she felt the sting of her husband's indifference. When the dancing began, Anne joined in, as was expected of her. But Charles did not dance with her. He danced with other ladies, his attention divided, his eye wandering to young women who had no claim to the throne. The sight was a silent blow, a message that she could no longer ignore. Her place in his life was no longer secure. After the banquet, in the quiet solitude of her chambers, Anne confronted Charles. Their argument was a storm of words and emotions, but at its core was the truth that both had been avoiding. Charles blamed her for Brittany's growing independence, for the foreign alliances she had sought to strengthen her position. He accused her of being disloyal, of placing her people before the crown of France. Anne, her patience fraying, responded with equal sharpness. She reminded him of the promises he had made to her when they married, promises of respect for Brittany's autonomy and the preservation of her land's future. She pointed out that her actions had always been motivated by a desire to protect the interests of both France and Brittany, not to undermine them. The argument ended in silence, with Charles retreating to his study, and Anne left to wrestle with the harsh reality of her situation. The man she had once hoped to share her life with was now a stranger, and her marriage had become a political alliance born out of necessity rather than affection. Her heart, once full of hopes for a united reign, was now burdened with the weight of a kingdom at odds with her own. In the months that followed, the tension between Charles and Anne continued to escalate. The French court had become increasingly divided over the issue of Brittany. The nobles were pressing Charles to consolidate his rule over the duchy, and Anne could no longer ignore the undercurrent of treachery that was taking root within her own court. Some of her most trusted advisors were suggesting that she abandon her marriage to Charles and pursue an alliance with another power, perhaps even the English. The idea of seeking an English alliance was not something Anne took lightly. She knew that such a move would break the fragile peace between France and England, and it would undoubtedly leave her vulnerable to the wrath of both nations. But the suggestion spoke to her growing desperation. Charles's failures in Italy had only made his enemies bolder, and Anne realized that her marriage might soon become more of a liability than a strength. As she weighed her options, Anne received an unexpected message from the Duke of Savoy. The message offered an olive branch, a proposal for a diplomatic alliance that would secure Brittany's independence in exchange for her personal involvement in future negotiations. The offer was tempting, and Anne knew that it would send shockwaves through the French court. Anne had always been adept at playing the long game, but the stakes had never been higher. If she accepted the Duke's offer, it could shift the balance of power in Europe. But it also meant risking her marriage to Charles and alienating her homeland. The choices before her were not easy, but Anne knew that inaction would only lead to her undoing. As the year 1497 loomed on the horizon, Anne stood at the crossroads of fate. The choices she made now would define her future, and the future of Brittany. She could continue her uneasy marriage with Charles, attempting to mend the growing rift between them, and hope for an heir that would solidify her place in France. Or she could pursue a more daring path, one that could lead to war, but also offer Brittany a chance at true independence. The winds of change were not just blowing, they were howling, and Anne was caught in the middle of the storm. Her advisors urged caution, but Anne's heart was resolute. She knew that the future of her people lay not in her loyalty to France, but in her loyalty to herself. The time had come to make a choice that would echo through the annals of history. In the silence of her chamber, Anne gazed out over the waters of the Loire River, contemplating the path ahead. The kingdom of France, with all its power and splendor, seemed distant to her now. The world was changing, and she would change with it. Brittany was her heart, her soul, and her destiny, no matter what the cost. As winter turned to spring in 1497, the air around Anne seemed thick with the weight of her decisions. The months of turmoil in her marriage to Charles had finally reached a breaking point. The king's absence on campaign, distracted by Italy, and his ever-consuming ambitions, had only left her to rule alone. It was during this time, amid the growing isolation of her reign, that Anne decided to act. The proposal from the Duke of Savoy, though risky, was one she could not ignore. It was a lifeline for Brittany's sovereignty, one that might shield her land from the increasing pressure of the French crown. The terms were clear. In exchange for Brittany's continued independence, Anne would be required to engage in a series of political negotiations and, if the need arose, align herself with the Duke's military forces. To Anne, this offer was more than just a strategic alliance. It was a promise that she would not simply be a pawn in her marriage to Charles, but a sovereign ruler in her own right. She could no longer sit idly by as her fate and the fate of Brittany were dictated by a king whose loyalties were divided and whose intentions were increasingly unclear. As she gathered her council, Anne's voice was firm. "We will pursue this alliance with Savoy. Our future lies with Brittany, not with France," she declared. Her advisors, though loyal, were apprehensive. Some urged caution, warning her of the potential backlash from France. A break in relations with Charles could ignite a war, one that Brittany could ill afford. But Anne's mind was made up. The stakes were too high, and the crown of France was becoming more of a threat than a protector. That evening, Anne sent her reply to the Duke of Savoy, accepting his offer. She knew that this was a gamble, but it was one she had to take. If she failed, the consequences would be dire, not just for her, but for the people of Brittany. Within days of Anne's decision, word spread through the French court like wildfire. The news of her negotiations with the Duke of Savoy reached Charles, who had been unaware of her actions. It was a dagger to his pride, and he reacted with fury. He saw Anne's decision as an outright betrayal, a violation of the trust that was supposed to exist between them as rulers of both Brittany and France. Anne had expected this reaction. In fact, she had prepared herself for it. But what she hadn't anticipated was the speed with which Charles would retaliate. The king summoned her to the royal palace in Paris, determined to confront her personally. Anne, knowing that this confrontation was inevitable, made the long journey to the capital, her mind filled with a mixture of dread and resolve. She understood the consequences of her actions, but she had come to terms with them. The survival of Brittany, the land of her birth, was worth the price she might have to pay. When she arrived at the palace, the atmosphere was tense. Charles's court was thick with whispers, and Anne could sense the eyes of the French nobility upon her. They were watching not only her, but also the balance of power between Brittany and France. The tension between the two realms had never been so palpable. Charles, his face pale and drawn from the strain of his failed military campaigns, stood before her in the royal chambers. His expression was unreadable, but his anger was unmistakable. "So, it is true," Charles said coldly, his voice betraying his fury. "You have sought an alliance with the Duke of Savoy behind my back, aligning yourself with my enemies. Is this how you repay me for the honor I have bestowed upon you?" Anne stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No, Your Majesty, I have not betrayed you. I have done what is necessary for the survival of my people. Brittany is my priority." Charles's eyes flashed with disdain. "Brittany, always Brittany. You speak of loyalty to your people, but what of loyalty to me? To France? You are my queen, Anne. You swore an oath to uphold the crown of France." "I swore an oath to Brittany as well," Anne replied evenly, "and I will never break that oath. My first duty is to my land, to its people. You know this." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Anne's heart beat fiercely, but her resolve remained unwavering. She could feel the deepening divide between them. Charles had always been a king torn between his duties to France and his desire to conquer, but now it was clear that his ambitions had overridden everything else. His trust in her had evaporated, and the weight of his disappointment settled heavily between them. "This will not end well, Anne," Charles said, his voice a low growl. "I will not let Brittany slip from my grasp. I will not stand idly by and watch Brittany fall into the hands of another." Anne replied, "You may call it betrayal, but I call it survival." Charles stepped forward, his face hardening. "Then prepare for the consequences. If you choose Savoy over France, you will have to face the wrath of the entire kingdom." The confrontation in Paris marked the beginning of a bitter and dangerous turn in Anne's reign. Charles's reaction was swift and unforgiving. His ministers, already wary of Brittany's increasing autonomy, rallied behind him, calling for military action to reassert French control over the duchy. Anne, knowing that her move had ignited the flames of war, quickly called her own council to prepare for the coming conflict. The Duke of Savoy had promised military support, but Brittany's resources were limited. Anne knew that this would be a war of attrition, one that would test her resolve and the strength of her allies. As the months passed, the situation in Brittany became increasingly precarious. Charles's forces, reinforced by loyal French nobles, began to mobilize for an invasion. Anne's own army, though loyal and determined, was outnumbered and outgunned. But Anne's mind was sharp, and she knew that this war was not just about military might. It was about strategy, alliances, and timing. The battlefield was set, and Anne found herself not only fighting for her crown, but also for the survival of her people and the very identity of Brittany. She had made her choice, and now she would stand firm in the face of the storm that was about to break. By the summer of 1498, the clash between the forces of Brittany and France had erupted into full-scale war. Charles, with his larger and more experienced army, marched toward the borders of Brittany, intent on reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. Anne, however, was not one to be intimidated by force. She had already begun to gather her allies, both within Brittany and beyond, and prepared for a battle that would decide her fate. The people of Brittany, inspired by Anne's unwavering leadership, rallied to her cause. The duchy's fortified cities became the last bastions of resistance, and Anne's military commanders, skilled and loyal, worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming onslaught. The first major battle between the two armies took place outside the city of Rennes. The French forces, confident in their superiority, moved to encircle the Breton defenders. But Anne's strategy, drawn from her sharp understanding of terrain and military tactics, caught Charles's forces off guard. The Bretons fought fiercely, using their knowledge of the land to launch surprise attacks that threw the French into disarray. Though the battle was far from won, Anne's forces held their ground, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. The battle for Brittany had begun in earnest, and the outcome would determine the future of both Anne and the kingdom she had fought so hard to protect. The days leading up to the Battle of Rennes were quiet, almost eerily so. Anne spent most of her time in the war room, poring over maps and correspondence from her generals. The sounds of her army preparing for battle echoed faintly through the walls. But in that silence, Anne found a strange sense of clarity. The war that had been building for months, the struggle for her kingdom, was finally upon her. Anne's thoughts often drifted to the early days of her reign, when she had been a young queen, wide-eyed and hopeful. Her marriage to Charles had seemed like a path to security for Brittany, a way to keep the kingdom independent in the face of France's increasing power. But over the years, as her marriage to Charles had soured and the dreams of a united Brittany and France had crumbled, Anne realized how naive she had once been. Now the truth was undeniable. There was no room for diplomacy or compromise. There was only war. The sound of horse hooves and soldiers' shouts could be heard faintly outside the stone walls of her castle. Anne could feel the weight of her decision pressing upon her. She had chosen Brittany over everything else, but she also knew that every choice had consequences. She was no longer just a ruler in a palace. She was a symbol of resistance. The survival of her people, of her legacy, rested upon the outcome of the battle that was about to unfold. It was then that her trusted general, Gilles de Laval, entered the room, his face drawn with concern. "Your Majesty," he began, bowing slightly. "The French forces are advancing more quickly than we expected. They will be upon us within a few days." Anne looked up from her maps, her eyes steely. "How many?" "At least 20,000 strong. With their cavalry and artillery, they'll have the advantage of mobility and firepower," Gilles replied. "But our forces are well prepared. The terrain is in our favor, and we've fortified our positions as best as we can." Anne nodded, a sense of resolve settling within her. "Then we fight. We stand firm. We cannot afford to lose." The morning of the Battle of Rennes dawned crisp and clear, the sky streaked with pink and gold as the sun rose over the horizon. The air was thick with tension, and the faint sound of soldiers preparing for battle carried over the landscape. Anne stood at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the expanse of land that stretched before her. It was here that the future of Brittany would be decided. The Breton army, though outnumbered, was positioned strategically along the high ground. The French army, led by Charles's most trusted generals, advanced with precision, their banners fluttering in the wind. The sound of marching troops, The pounding of horses' hooves and the creak of war machines filled the air as both sides prepared for the inevitable clash. Anne rode out with her commanders, her presence on the battlefield, a symbol of strength and resolve. Dressed in her armor, she was a striking figure, her dark hair tucked beneath a helmet, her sword gleaming in the early morning light. Her heart raced with the anticipation of what was to come, but her resolve was unwavering. This was no longer just a battle for Brittany's independence. It was a battle for her legacy, for the sovereignty she had sworn to protect. As the Breton forces took their positions, the air grew thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and metal. Anne stood by, her generals, her eyes scanning the battlefield for any signs of movement. Her mind raced through the plans they had meticulously laid out. She had to keep the French forces at bay for as long as possible, buy time for reinforcements to arrive, buy time for Brittany to hold its ground. The first arrow flew through the air, striking a soldier on the edge of the Breton line. The battle had begun. The thunder of hooves and the clash of steel soon filled the air as the two armies collided. The Breton soldiers, inspired by their queen's presence, fought with a fierce determination. They knew that if they lost today, their kingdom would be lost forever. Anne's forces held firm on the high ground, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. But the French were relentless. They had superior numbers and better equipped soldiers, and slowly they began to push back the Bretons. Anne's generals barked orders, urging their soldiers to hold their lines, but the pressure from the French forces was overwhelming. The battle raged on, the sounds of swords clashing and shields breaking reverberating across the field. Anne rode through the chaos, urging her men to fight harder, to hold on longer. She could see the French cavalry beginning to encircle the Breton forces, their long spears gleaming in the sunlight. But just as all seemed lost, a shout went up from the rear of the Breton army. Reinforcements. The Duke of Savoy had kept his promise. The arrival of the Savoy forces turned the tide of the battle. Led by their own commanders, the Savoy troops struck the French army from behind, catching them by surprise. The French were now caught in a vice, with the Breton forces holding the high ground and the Savoy forces attacking from the rear. Anne seized the moment, rallying her troops. "Now, push forward," she shouted. With renewed vigor, the Breton army surged forward, driving back the French forces. The battlefield became a chaotic frenzy as soldiers clashed in close combat, blood staining the earth beneath their feet. Anne's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was focused. She rode along the front lines, offering words of encouragement to her soldiers, urging them to fight for their homes, their families, their future. It was in the midst of this chaos that Anne saw him, Charles. The king was riding at the front of his forces, his face twisted in anger and frustration. He had never expected this kind of resistance. He had never expected Anne to be the one to stand against him. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and, for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time seemed to stretch between them, the weight of years of political maneuvering, betrayal, and lost trust hanging heavy in the air. Anne knew that this moment, this confrontation, was inevitable. But she also knew that she had no choice but to continue forward. The battle was far from over, but the French forces were now in disarray. The Breton soldiers, bolstered by the arrival of their allies, began to gain ground. Slowly the tide of the battle began to turn in Anne's favor. By late afternoon, the French forces were in full retreat. The Breton army, battered but unbroken, had emerged victorious. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the stench of death and smoke. Anne stood amidst the chaos, her face covered in sweat and grime, but her eyes shining with determination. As she dismounted her horse and walked through the ranks of her soldiers, they cheered, their voices rising in triumph. Anne had led them to victory, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Brittany would survive. She had protected her people, and in doing so, had secured her place in history. Charles, meanwhile, had retreated from the battlefield, his army shattered and demoralized. The defeat at Rennes was a crushing blow to his ambitions. Anne knew, however, that this victory was only the beginning. The war was far from over. There would be many more battles to fight, many more challenges to overcome. But for now, she allowed herself a brief moment of triumph. She had won the Battle of Rennes, and with it, the future of Brittany. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the battlefield. The once bustling scene had become eerily silent, save for the distant cries of the wounded and the sound of footsteps as soldiers moved among the fallen. The battle was over. Brittany had triumphed, but Anne knew that victory was a double-edged sword. The price of the win had been steep. Thousands of lives had been lost on both sides. The bodies of fallen soldiers, comrades and enemies alike, lay strewn across the land, their lifeblood staining the earth. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. Anne stood amidst the carnage, her thoughts focused not on the celebrations, but on the true cost of the conflict. The people of Brittany had paid dearly for this victory, and yet their struggle was far from over. Anne knew that the French were not a force to be reckoned with. They had lost this battle, but they would regroup, they would adapt. The war was far from finished. She couldn't afford to rest on her laurels, not when her kingdom teetered on the brink of destruction. Gilles de Laval, her trusted general, approached her, his face drawn with exhaustion. His armor was bloodied, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, the battlefield is secure," he said, his voice low. "But we've suffered heavy losses. The French may have retreated, but they won't forget this defeat." Anne nodded somberly. "I know. This victory has bought us time, but time is all we have. We cannot stop here." Her mind raced through the possibilities, the strategies. The French were formidable, but so were the forces loyal to her. The battle had shown that with the right alliances, they could still stand their ground. She just had to ensure that those alliances held, and that her kingdom remained united. "Prepare the troops for a swift return to the capital," Anne ordered. "We must shore up our defenses and send word to our allies. This war is not yet won." Gilles hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "And Charles? He will seek revenge. We can't afford to underestimate him." Anne's gaze hardened. "Charles may have lost this battle, but he still has the power to break us. We must be ready for whatever comes next." As Anne mounted her horse and rode back toward her camp, her thoughts shifted to the future of Brittany. She had fought to protect her people, to preserve her kingdom's independence, but at what cost? The price of freedom was often bloodshed, and Brittany had paid dearly for that freedom. She couldn't help but wonder, how many more battles would it take before the crown she wore became nothing more than a crown of thorns? The journey back to Rennes was long and tiring, but Anne could feel the weight of the victory hanging over her like a dark cloud. The soldiers were weary, their spirits bruised, but their loyalty to her was unquestionable. They had followed her into battle, and they would follow her again, no matter the cost. When they finally arrived at the capital, Anne was met with a mixture of cheers and apprehensive silence. The people of Rennes had heard of the victory, but they also knew that their city had paid a heavy toll. The streets were filled with the wounded, and the once bustling marketplaces were now eerily quiet. The war had touched every corner of their lives. Anne entered the palace with a sense of unease. The walls of her own home seemed to close in on her. She had won the battle, but at what cost? Was it worth the lives of her people? The question gnawed at her, and she knew that it was a question she would carry with her for the rest of her reign. As she entered the council chamber, Anne was greeted by her advisors, who wasted no time in discussing the aftermath of the battle. But as the discussions continued, it became clear that not all of her allies were as steadfast as she had hoped. "Your Majesty, we must consider the next steps carefully," said Francois, the Duke of Laval, a seasoned politician and one of Anne's most trusted advisors. "The victory is significant, but we cannot afford to ignore the internal tensions within Brittany. There are factions among the nobility who are already questioning your leadership." Anne's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Not everyone is as committed to your cause as they appear," Francois continued. "There are whispers of dissent within the court. Some of the nobles are eager to make deals with the French in exchange for their own power and influence. They believe that a different approach may be more favorable for Brittany. Anne's heart sank. She had suspected that some nobles were more interested in their own ambitions than in the survival of Brittany, but hearing it spoken so plainly was a bitter blow. "And what do you suggest, Francois?" she asked, her voice cold. "I think it would be wise to start making alliances with those factions who are still loyal to you," Francois replied cautiously. "Strengthen your position within the court. The French may have retreated, but that does not mean we are safe. We need to prepare for the next phase of the war, and we cannot do so if we are divided within our own walls." Anne stared out the window, her thoughts heavy. Her father had often warned her that a ruler's greatest enemy was not the foreign invader, but the traitor within. She had never truly understood the depth of his words until now. "Very well," Anne said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I will not let Brittany fall to betrayal from within or without. We shall make no peace with the French unless they are willing to recognize our sovereignty. And as for the nobles," her eyes flashed with determination, "I will deal with them in time." The council members nodded, though some exchanged wary glances. Anne's words were resolute, but they all knew the truth. Her reign was fragile. Victory on the battlefield had bought her time, but she was now walking a razor's edge. Allies could turn into enemies at a moment's notice, and the stability of Brittany was far from secure. As the days passed, Anne continued to solidify her position within the court. She met with various nobles, some of whom had been skeptical of her leadership and attempted to win their loyalty through careful diplomacy and promises of future rewards. Yet, for every ally she gained, there were whispers of betrayal in the shadows. Some nobles, it seemed, had already begun to entertain the idea of negotiating with the French in exchange for power. Meanwhile, the French king, Charles, had retreated to Paris, but Anne knew he would not stay quiet for long. Rumors of his growing anger and the French monarchy's plans for retaliation reached her ears daily. She had no illusions about the nature of the man she had once married. Charles would stop at nothing to claim Brittany, and his defeat at Rennes would only fuel his determination to crush the resistance. In the coming weeks, Anne would face a choice that would define her reign. Would she continue to fight for Brittany's independence at all costs, or would she seek a tenuous peace with France, risking her kingdom's future to preserve her own throne? The crown of Brittany had never been more fragile, but Anne would not allow herself to be intimidated. She had survived too much to surrender. Now. Late one night, as Anne sat alone in her chambers, pondering the difficult choices ahead, a soft knock on the door broke her reverie. When she bade the visitor to enter, she was surprised to find a messenger from the Duke of Savoy standing in the doorway, holding a sealed letter. "Your Majesty, this arrived just this evening," the messenger said, bowing low. Anne took the letter and broke the seal. As she read, her heart quickened. The Duke of Savoy had made a daring offer, a more formal alliance, a pledge of military and financial support in exchange for Brittany's recognition of Savoy's influence in the region. It was an offer that could tip the balance of power in her favor, but at a cost. The decision weighed heavily on her mind. To accept this offer might secure her kingdom's future, but it could also alienate other key allies, and the price of that alliance could prove more costly than she realized. As she stared at the letter, Anne's gaze hardened with resolve. The crown she wore had always been one of fragile power, but in this moment, she knew what must be done. There was no going back now. The crisp morning air of Rennes felt oddly still, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. The cobblestone streets, usually bustling with the clamor of merchants and townsfolk, were quieter than usual. The mood in the capital had shifted since the battle. An unspoken tension had taken root in the hearts of those who once cheered her victory. Anne knew it was only a matter of time before the calm broke. Inside the walls of the palace, Anne sat in her study, her hands tightly clutching the letter from the Duke of Savoy. The ink seemed to burn through the paper as she read it again, the words refusing to leave her mind. His offer was both generous and dangerous, a lifeline for Brittany's future, but one that carried its own set of hidden costs. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering candles on the table. Despite the flickering warmth, a cold dread settled in her chest. Brittany's future hung on the delicate balance of power she had to maintain. But at what cost? The offer from the Duke would bind Brittany to Savoy, forever altering the course of her kingdom's fate. The knock on her door broke the silence, and Anne glanced up sharply. "Enter," she commanded. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped inside, Francois, the Duke of Laval. His face, as always, was unreadable, his eyes reflecting the depth of the political current swirling beneath the surface. He carried with him a grim air, and Anne instantly knew that whatever news he brought would not be pleasant. "Your Majesty," Francois began, bowing respectfully. "There is something you need to hear." Anne motioned for him to continue, her heart pounding. "A small group of our nobles have met in secret with the French ambassadors," Francois said, his voice low. "They are already considering terms of peace with King Charles. If we are not careful, we risk losing everything." Anne's eyes narrowed. "How many?" "Some of the most influential among us," Francois replied. "The Count of Penthièvre, the Viscount of Rohan. Their treachery runs deep. They believe that a peace treaty with the French is their only hope to keep their lands and privileges intact." "And what do they think of me?" Anne's voice was icy. "They view you as an obstacle," Francois said bluntly. "A woman who has led the kingdom into a war it cannot afford. They see themselves as the real power in Brittany, and they will do whatever it takes to protect their interests." Anne rose from her chair, pacing the room in agitation. This was not news she could easily dismiss. The rift within her own court was widening, and every day the stakes grew higher. "I will not let them tear my kingdom apart," Anne muttered, more to herself than to Francois. He watched her for a moment before speaking again. "There is more. The Duke of Savoy is prepared to meet with you. He has sent word that he will arrive within the week. He insists on speaking with you in person, and I suspect his offer may come with even greater demands than we anticipated." Anne froze. "And what do you suggest?" Francois hesitated. "We need to act quickly, Your Majesty. If the French are already moving behind our backs, and if Savoy is playing both sides, we must secure our position before it slips further out of our grasp." Anne stood at the window, staring out over the city. Her mind was racing. The path she chose now would shape not just her future, but the future of every person in Brittany. She could not afford to be weak or indecisive. "Prepare for the Duke's arrival," she said finally, her voice steady. "But we will not be rushed into a decision. Let him come and we will hear him out. But know this, Brittany's future will not be dictated by the ambitions of foreign rulers or traitors in our midst." Francois bowed once more, though the concern in his eyes was clear. "As you wish, Your Majesty." Anne turned her gaze to the battlefield, the memory of the carnage at Rennes still fresh in her mind. The victory had come at a great cost, but the real battle had just begun. Her enemies were not only outside the walls of the kingdom, they were inside it too. Days passed in tense silence. Anne took every opportunity to meet with her most loyal allies, strengthening their resolve, while also attempting to gauge the loyalty of those who were less certain. Her court was divided, but she had no choice but to keep up appearances and maintain control of the situation, even as the pressure continued to mount. The arrival of the Duke of Savoy came as no surprise. His emissaries had already made their presence known, and soon the palace gates opened to allow the Duke's procession entry into Rennes. The city, which had been tense in the days before, seemed to hold its breath once again. Anne met the Duke in the grand hall of the palace. He was a tall man, his dark hair falling in waves around his shoulders, his eyes sharp and calculating. His appearance was regal, but there was an unsettling air about him. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had dealt with kings and queens his entire life. "Your Majesty," the Duke said, bowing low as he approached. "It is an honor to meet you in person." Anne offered a polite smile, though her eyes remained cold. "The honor is mine, Your Grace. Please, take a seat." They exchanged pleasantries, but the tension between them was palpable. The Duke was no fool. He understood the precariousness of Anne's situation. He knew that Brittany was vulnerable, and he was determined to exploit that vulnerability for his own gain. "I come with an offer, Your Majesty," the Duke said, his tone smooth and calculated. "An offer that can secure Brittany's future, a future that does not involve further bloodshed." Anne listened intently, but she could not shake the feeling that this was more than just a political negotiation. The Duke's offer was an intricate web, one that, if accepted, could trap Brittany in a new set of alliances, and perhaps even betray the very ideal she had fought for. He spoke of military support, of riches and trade routes, of promises of protection from the French. It sounded almost too good to be true, so good that Anne felt an instinctual wariness in her gut. "And what do you ask in return?" Anne asked, her voice low. The Duke smiled, a slight curve of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "A simple request, Your Majesty. Brittany would align itself with Savoy, and we would stand as one against any threat, be it from France or elsewhere. In return, we would provide you with the resources and support you need to maintain your sovereignty." Anne took a deep breath. It was a tempting offer, one that could change the course of her kingdom's fate. But it was also a dangerous one. "We'll need time to consider your proposal, Your Grace," Anne said, standing up and giving him a curt nod. "We will speak again soon." The Duke bowed, his smile never fading. "Of course, Your Majesty. I will await your answer with great anticipation." That night, as Anne lay in her bed, she wrestled with the decision before her. Her kingdom was on the brink, and every choice she made would determine whether Brittany would survive as an independent entity or fall into the hands of foreign powers. The internal threats were just as dangerous as the external ones. Her people were tired, their spirits shattered by war. The nobles were divided, and the French were only waiting for the right moment to strike back. Anne could feel the storm approaching. Whether it would be the storm of war or the storm of betrayal, she could not say. But it was coming, and she had no time to lose. In the end, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what path she chose, she would not be remembered as a ruler who bowed to the will of others. Brittany's future would be shaped by her hands, alone. As the candlelight flickered in the room, Anne made her decision. Tomorrow, she would meet with the Duke of Savoy and offer him her answer. It would be a choice that could either save Brittany or doom it forever.